Hi, I'm Matthew Gray. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the challenges that we faced in WebAnswers that seem like they'd be interesting and relevant to this group. I'm based in Cambridge, but I'm actually here in Mountain View this week. The inspiration for this was I was chatting with Martin and Fernanda in Cambridge, and sort of we were talking through some of the kinds of things that we're facing in WebAnswers and in search and ranking in general, following the Guardian articles and now the opportune timing, the explosions of last week in terms of some of the press around WebAnswers in challenging areas. So I wanted to start with explaining what WebAnswers is and a little bit of how it works. So WebAnswers is the system by which if you say, why is this guy blue, you get a box of text at the top of the page with a source from the search results that we believe in the passage and the source in combination answer your question. Now, the high-level product goal here is to sort of solve the open domain question answering problem. This relates to things like knowledge graph, in that there's multiple ways to try and solve the problem of question answering. One is to sort of build a database and write it all down. The other is to try and solve it with the sort of the open domain natural language processing kind of machine learning kinds of approaches. So fundamentally, from a product perspective, our goal is to essentially answer any and every question in the way that an expert assistant or librarian might answer it for you. And we're supposed to do this with an understanding of what the user's intent is. So if a user says, why is the sky blue? We understand that to be a question. If the user says, who put the bop in the bop shabop? We understand that is not actually a question, even though it is formulated as one. Similarly, if a user says, group of whales, we know what that really means is what is a group of whales called. Now, from a core technology perspective, the way WebAnswers works is it's a pseudo-relevance feedback system at its core. We look at the web results and we understand from the web results the kinds of things we expect the answer to look like. So as a concrete example, if I say, why is the sky blue? We are built fundamentally on top of search ranking. Search ranking is awesome. If I search for why is the sky blue, I've got a lot of results that tell me why the sky is blue. And if we look across those results and say, wow, the word scattering appears a lot here. Wow, the word wavelength appears a lot here. That allows us to understand that's the kind of thing that we expect to have in the answer. Now, there's other layers on top of this, including things that try and understand specific focus words. If you say, which president freed the slaves, we want to understand the president, the sort of relatively traditional natural language processing techniques. That's how we started out there. The president part is the answer. It sort of doesn't matter what the rest of the answer is other than Abraham Lincoln, but you really got to say Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, you really do want to say Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation. You don't want to just say Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. Yeah, that doesn't quite fulfill it, even though Abraham Lincoln is the salient part. So we have a system that understands that president is what we're seeking, that Abraham Lincoln is a very president-y kind of phrase, and that we can answer from that. Now, on top of this sort of bootstrap of this pseudo-relevance feedback and type match kind of system, we built a lot of layers of technology, including a lot of things that sort of generalize from these. So we understand when you've got the word why in a query, you want things like the word because in the answer. And the core pieces of this are to sort of aggressively learn what we can from observing how users interact and pay attention to metrics, how we collect ratings, and those kinds of things. So the specific engineering details are we've got a machine learning model. It's a decision forest of stumps based on a bunch of signals that jointly gives us a quality score that we use both as a prediction of the accuracy and a prediction of triggering. So basically, one of the things that this means is that we can very smoothly adjust our triggering. So we can say, oh, we want to double coverage. We know exactly how much of our precision we will lose. We want to increase precision. We know exactly how much of our coverage we will lose. But this introduces some complexities that I'll talk about in a bit. Now, how do we think about this in the context of scary queries, for lack of a better word? And one of the things we talk about in terms of policy is we talk about user harm. So some of the categories of queries that we worry a lot about are things like the ones that exploded a couple of weeks ago. Is Obama planning a coup? Do Black Lives Matter? Does racial group smell? That kind of query, where these are hate queries. These are politically charged queries. And there's this fundamental question of where do we care a lot more than other places? Because we care about being right and we care about being wrong. But my canonical example here is always, if I say, what kind of dog is Scooby-Doo? What kind of dog is Scooby-Doo? This is a great answer. Tells you it's Great Dane. If I were to instead say, Scooby-Doo was a TV show in the 1970s and 1980s, following the adventures of the mystery gang or whatever, that's not right, but it's not wrong and misleading in a way that is harmful to users. Now, if we say he was a Great Dane, it's correct. If we say he was a sheepdog, that's actually super misleading, because it turns out an early version of Scooby-Doo was a sheepdog, but really he's not a sheepdog, and you're sort of actively misleading the user. Now, if you mislead the user on what kind of dog Scooby-Doo was, the user harm is fairly mild. But if you mislead the user on reinforcing negative stereotypes about the world, telling them where their voting place is, telling them dosages of drugs, things like that, there's a more serious danger. So user harm tends to be the fundamental place that we sort of start coming at from the perspective of, why isn't this just a plain old quality problem? Why don't we just think about this in terms of answering more questions correctly and fewer questions incorrectly? But there's one other aspect of it, and this is why I gave the Scooby-Doo example, which is trust. So one of the problems here is, great, if we tell people that Scooby-Doo was a sheepdog, no one is really getting hurt for that. Like, it doesn't matter that we told them wrong, except that the user may very promptly figure out that we were wrong, and will learn that, oh, this thing Google puts in a box is supposed to be accurate. I now know that I can't trust it. And we care about users trusting it. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we care and why we care in these kinds of queries in particular. So user trust is complicated. User trust is hard. And to be honest, with all of the kinds of things that happen around this, around PR and things like this, there's an element where I really want to care about the user and not care about PR. We can live our own PR bubble, but PR affects that perception of user trust. And that's sort of fundamental to why we think about these kinds of problems. So let's talk about one other important philosophical piece here, which is, how much should we take manual action versus algorithmic action? And it's broadly been the philosophy in search to take algorithmic action rather than manual action. And the reason for this is multiple-fold. So the biggest reason is that algorithmic action scales in a way that manual action doesn't. WebAnswers is a tail product in the extreme. So the average number of times a day that a knowledge graph answer provides an answer to the same question is between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude more frequent than the average number of times we provide any given web answer. Even though, like, why is the sky blue? People just don't ask that individual question often, but they answer every day millions upon millions of unique questions. And those questions change from today to tomorrow to next month to next year in a way that algorithmic solutions are the only way we're going to really do this at scale. So that said, it is a box that we're putting at the top of the search results page, and it is different than a plain old organic search result. It is more like a plain old organic search result than some other kinds of features, in that we are crediting it to a third party. And for all the sort of debate there is about that, we understand that users understand this pretty well. But we will take manual action under some circumstances. And one of the things that I found is a challenge to communicate even internally is, this means that there's this interesting category of things. We have policy around what we will take manual action on, and we have a product goal of the things we don't want to do. And that means there's sort of there's a gap. That is, there's things we say, oh, we're not going to take manual action, but we really want to fix it. And that's where the sort of the deep challenges of the algorithms come in. So let me talk a little bit about the kinds of problems that we face. So we face a lot of just core quality problems, and I'm mostly not going to talk about those. We talk about, how do we understand today that Donald Trump is a president rather than a celebrity and a businessman, which all of the sort of type indicator kinds of things we have are really confident that he's a celebrity and businessman, but not that he's a politician. And that's a core quality problem, and we spend a lot of time on that, but that's not the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. So one of the interesting challenges we face in thinking about this from a policy perspective is we care a lot about not showing hate speech. And hate speech is one of these things that it increasingly in the current political climate gets mixed with worldview. And if we talk about questions like, are all ethnic group racists? Well, that's sort of easy to talk about. But when we talk about crime statistics, well, if we have crime statistics that are 100% factual, but are being presented in a hateful context, how do we deal with that? And really short, I'm going to talk a little bit about solutions, but a lot of these things are really these open problems. So if someone is saying this ethnic group is violent, well, sure, that actually falls under our blacklist-worthy policies. On the other hand, if presentation of facts is done in a highly tilted and skewed way, we need to be both cautious about making sure that we're saying, well, where is it the Google perspective, and where is it the Matthew perspective, and where is it actually something that we actually want to enforce sort of algorithmically and systematically. So I think hate comes in these multiple levels, and we've spent a lot of time on our policies trying to articulate some of the nuances of what we consider these things here. So let me give a more extreme example. Is Vladimir Putin corrupt? Okay, Vladimir Putin is a public figure on the world stage. He has been characterized as corrupt by the US Treasury Department. He is the leader, though, of an entire people who have a sort of identity, both nationally and with him as a particular leader. In my personal opinion, is Vladimir Putin corrupt? And we don't actually trigger this one today because we have had some, well, oh, yeah, there we go. I think this is actually pretty good. It's sourced from the BBC, from a nice authoritative source. It's quoting an US Treasury Department. It's well, however, and that's not Putin though. But
would it show the same result for a user based in Russia?
Well, no, because they're not, rather, if they're issuing the query on .com in English, probably maybe subject to incidental localization of you may or may not get the BBC in the result set, but there's no change based on oath in English query in Russian. In Russian, I actually don't know offhand. But there's a full spectrum from earnest, sincere political criticism of a politician to full-blown hate, and finding that line has been hard. We talk about things like how do we deal with things like fact-checking. And great, there's all these fact-checking out there. And one of the questions is, what do you do if InfoWars, so InfoWars is a site that is on the extreme right, and they tend to be an extreme propagator of conspiracy theories. They're one of the big advocates of this notion that Hillary Clinton is a pedophile who goes to crazy sex islands, et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking very extreme perspective. But especially in today's political climate, they have this prominence that is interesting and challenging. And if they suddenly started running fact checks, how do we figure out how to rank it? So this is, like I said, one of these big open problems of we sort of know hate when we see it at one extreme, and we sort of can say, oh, we want to be, we don't want to turn all political criticism into hate speech. But there's this very nasty edge of what are people's worldview and how do we manage that? So that's one of the big challenges that we face. I think I've been proud of Google's willingness to actually take a stand on some of these borderline edge cases, but at the same time, I think it's, however much I have a particular set of politics, I don't want our actual politics to inject into this in a way that it's like, well, okay, Google has certain values, but we need to be attendant to the fact that we sometimes actually want to make sure that we're showing some balance here. So there's one other category. I said earlier that we care about answering all the questions. There's actually one big category, which I'll call the illegal instruction exception, because it's amusing, which is if you ask how to kill yourself, if you ask how to commit a crime, if you ask how to do something illegal, we have actually really good answers for how to do these awful things in many cases, because we are really good at understanding how-to queries, we're understanding instructions, we have natural language understanding of the discourse around instructions, and people on the internet write instructions on how to do these awful things. This is the only category today that we will take manual action on, as an example, based exclusively on the fact of what the question is. There's no answer to the question, how to kill yourself, that we would consider okay. In general, the other things that we think about it in conjunction with the actual question being, the answer being given. So turns out this one is one that actually yields fairly well to straightforward algorithmic solutions. We do things like we understand really well whether something's instruction-seeking query within WebAnswers, because we understand that the language and the discourse around instruction-seeking queries is very different than it is for definition-seeking queries, and that's fundamental to our scoring. So we spend a lot of time getting very precise query classification, and then it turns out figuring out whether or not it's illegal activity related is not as trivial or not as already well solved, but is the kind of thing that we can do. So next, and this is actually comes back to the question of manual action, sorry, go ahead.
So one question about the illegal instruction. Has there been any pushback on that? Like, do people generally feel like that's okay that Google does that, or do people object to that?
No one objects to that. I mean, there are some extreme cases where we have never actually had to deal with them that people have imagined around things that some people would consider self-harm and some people wouldn't. So a concrete example is, okay, so anorexia and bulimia are clearly in the self-harm kind of category. We don't want instructions on that. There are extreme diets that some people would consider self-harm and some people would consider, no, this is just a dietary choice a person wants to make. We have never actually run into a case where we've actually had to resolve that, but it has been proposed as hypothetically, this is an edge case. We've not had to deal with that. We tend to prescribe it pretty narrowly, but broadly enough that like we don't get any objection. I mean, like there's, I've not heard any Googler ever make the pro-ana case, which is, great, because that's, I think, the pro-ana is pro-anorexia. It's people who are advocating this as a dietary lifestyle. And, it's not something we're going to do. So bias is a really, really hard problem. And this one actually is one that we really don't know how to solve yet. We have some ideas, we've done some measurements, and this is why I get so nervous about blacklisting. So let's talk about political bias as an obvious example here. I understand how our signals work today, and there's nothing structural, but this is not to say that there's no bias, but there's nothing structural that should introduce a bias. There's nothing that's, our system structurally should favor conservative or liberal politics. However, such thing could creep in either by virtue of the training data, either by virtue of the user behavior, or by virtue of all sorts of other things. But if I say, well, we are going to start enforcing certain things with manual action, when we take manual blacklisting action, it is reactive, not proactive. We do it occasionally. If we start doing this on things that are biased, it's very easy for us to imagine that we could start injecting bias into the system by virtue of the things that are getting reported within Google, because Googlers have a privileged escalation channel. They can go bad. So one of the things we did to try and mitigate this is we actually said, great, external users can give us feedback. How do we make sure that they are able to give it the feedback in a similar way? And so we actually, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail later, we actually made it so it can get escalated internally in exactly the same way. That said, the things that we still choose to take manual action on are a big source of concern. So at one point during the elections last year, there were some concerns that WebAnswers were showing images, partisan imagery on nonpartisan election-related queries. This was, there was a lot of discussion of should we take manual action here, showing a picture of Hillary Clinton or a Trump logo next to a generic election-related result does not sound good. Should we take manual action? And in particular, there were a lot of concerns that we were showing pictures of Hillary, and people were concerned that reinforces the public's perception of Google's political biases. So we wanted to avoid the risk of those accusations. So what I did is I went through and I looked at every single image that we showed on every single query containing the word election at the time. Turns out you can look at a lot of images very quickly. And for 98.4% of them, we were showing charts and graphs and maps, which makes me very proud of that fact. And for the remaining 1.6%, we were showing some pictures of Hillary and some pictures of the Trump-Pence logo, and it was almost exactly 50-50. This bolstered my notion of, well, gee, the one that was reported was this one side of it. No one reported the other one to us at that particular moment. That's an example where had we taken manual action, it would have been introducing a bias. Now, it admittedly was tail and extreme, but it's the kind of thing that I worry about. Now, as another example, if I sort of tell this not as partially as a joke, but partially as a serious metaphor here. If someone on my team comes to me and says, I have a launch that that substantially improves coverage or substantially increases quality, in general, for what it's worth, when we increase quality, we adjust our threshold such that we increase coverage. So we maintain this 90% precision bar of, so in general, improving quality increases coverage. So they say, I've got a change that increases coverage, and particularly it works around recipe queries. And it has this weird side effect of it really promotes casserole-related recipes, and it really demotes soup-related recipes. Well, fine, let's launch that. I don't have a stand on bias or fairness between soup and casserole. On the other hand, if someone said, oh, I've got this great launch, it substantially increases coverage, but it substantially increases the number of answers, like it adds 200 good answers in our eval set for queries that are seeking men, and loses 60 that are seeking women. So that nets out positive. Oh, well, no, I'm not so comfortable with that idea, because this introduces the kind of bias that we care about, which actually has led to the very interesting problem of which kind of biases do we care about? And so the three easy ones that we can articulate is we care about gender bias, we care about racial bias, and we care about political bias. But there's a bunch of other ones that we probably should be caring about, but are harder to think about. One of my other canonical examples, again, that I think about here is, if we say top movies of all time, and it's only top Hollywood movies, and it doesn't include any films from outside the United States, that's another kind of bias. Now, there's even further, there was a query, we actually had a doodle on this that was an interesting case of first woman astronaut. And in fact, who was the first woman astronaut, and who was the first woman in space? Who was the first woman in space might have a different answer than who was the first woman astronaut, because astronaut is the word that Americans use, in which case the answer might be Sally Ride. But who was the first woman in space? Sure as heck better be Valentina Tereshkova, first cosmonaut. But actually the user might be, when they say astronaut, they might really be meaning person who went to space. And again, if I say, that one we get. Oh, there we go. So this is, these variants get sort of confusing kinds of things. So now, is that a bias that we want to correct for or not? If you say top films, top grossing films, and we understand the user almost certainly really meaning top American films. Well, what if I say first person to discover America? Oh crap, that's a different kind of biasing, I think. And our current main thought on these kinds of things is how we can think about this and I'll talk a little bit more about some of this later, but is in terms of adversarial eval and how we can measure, we can take particular things, particular query sets and say, we have reason to believe. Now, this is a very hard construction problem. So if you know how to construct these, I'm very interested in answering. If I have two query sets that I have every reason to believe should perform similarly. So if I have a query set about men and a query set about women, and they are similar prominence on similar topics, I have every reason to believe these should perform similarly. I can now measure precision. I can now measure recall. I can now measure characteristics of those and say, as we go forward, I don't want to launch something that accidentally skews dramatically. You're allowed some amount of noise, but how do you do it? Well, constructing those query sets in the first place is really, really hard. And we have some notions about how we might go about doing it, but not a lot. So this is the kind of thing that I would love for folks in this kind of, there's thoughts on here's how you can construct, bias measuring sets for ongoing evaluation. That's an appealing problem for us to solve. So now I want to talk about humor and earnestness. So is Theresa May or is Donald Trump a lizard person? The answer is yes. They are all lizard people. It is all over the internet. It's clear. This is the Huffington Post, actually, left-leaning but highly reputable source. It says Donald Trump is a shape-shifting lizard. If you don't believe us, read this sign. It talks about a highway sign that says Donald Trump is a shape-shifting lizard person. Okay, fine. At the very end of the article, they say, no, we don't actually have any evidence he's a shape-shifting lizard person, but still, the headline is this. And the reason there's this, it's implicitly funny. Ha ha, no one actually believes Donald Trump is a shape-shifting lizard person. It's funny that someone put up a sign saying he's a shape-shifting lizard person. It's implicit. Now, if the user asks, is Donald Trump a lizard person or is Theresa May a lizard person, we can assume that it's in that same vein of humorousness. Unless they ask, is Obama planning a coup? Because I think a lot of the assumption here is, it's absurd that you would think, except for the fact that this is now a super prominent part of the political discourse. And there's this hard problem of these things that we think of as obviously humor, obviously absurd, become part of the discourse. We've got things like, who invented stairs? For those of you who didn't know, it was invented in 1948 by a Swiss architect. He should have, patented it because he would have pretty good. Okay. So it turns out this page is a blog post, and again, is implicitly humor. The owner of this page, I don't think actually believes this to be true. They thought it was funny. In fact, they found it on a GeoCities page, and they put it in there. And the GeoCities page, which of course is gone because GeoCities is long dead. But if you go to archive.org and look at the GeoCities page, it has a little disclaimer at the bottom. In case this isn't obvious, this is a parody. But that got lost in this person. They had this implicitly humor. And then we further have the problem. Now there's people who are credulous who are they don't think hard enough about how it's plausible that stairs weren't invented until 1948. And it gets repeated. And it's like, well, okay, at some level, what's the user harm? Except for the fact that who invented stairs? Well, we've seen query sessions where it's like, it's clearly a child doing some sort of report. And they're going, famous examples of stairs, who invented stairs, pictures of stairs. Wait, what? Now we just told them that they were invented in 1948, and that's bad, and it erodes this kind of trust. So I think this problem around humor is that especially sort of straight up dry irony is really, really hard and challenging. And I think we need to figure out some ways, and we've done this in some places, to sort of smear the understanding of, okay, we understand that this site, this area is being 100% sarcastic. Problem is, this guy's blog, who's doing the stairs thing, it's mostly actually just his blog, and he thought this one post would be funny. So it's a really hard problem because the spectrum from who invented stairs and is Theresa May a lizard person and is Obama planning a coup is I think a sort of slippery slope, and I think there's some element of these are credible for some definition of credible sources that are both repeating and generating these things in the first place. All right, next I want to talk about debate. So debate comes in is an interesting problem because I think debate is actually really important on a lot of the kinds of issues that we're talking about. But there's a few different problems here. So one is sometimes users are seeking debate, but sometimes users are seeking just an answer. And there's a challenge there. How do you communicate that there's a debate? But there's two particular problems here that I want to talk about. One is devil's advocacy. So it turns out there's a lot of things on the internet that talk about relatively settled subjects, but there are people who actively want to engage in the devil's advocacy debate, and some of them are really smart, reasonable people. They're not jerks making the case. They're just trying to actually extend the discourse. Say, what are the flaws in this devil's advocate argument? The problem is a product like WebAnswers can actually erroneously extract a small segment of that. It can take it out of context. It can make it misleading. There's also the problem of users issuing extremely loaded questions as queries. If I'm asking the question, which sex island does Hillary Clinton visit? Well, that sort of is assuming in the first place that she's going to sex islands. So that introduces a new layer of challenge. But the next aspect of it is one that actually I worry about a lot, which is there's a tactic that is ubiquitous, but it feels like it's become more ubiquitous, which is the creation of debate to suppress consensus. And the canonical example here is things like, do vaccines cause autism? But there's a lot of other examples where the idea, or did the Holocaust happen? There's things where it's a matter of consensus, the Holocaust happened. But by virtue of creating a debate, you say, well, okay, well, let's show both sides of the story, as if there are necessarily these both sides of the story. And this is the problem with some of the sort of straightforward imagined things of, well, what if we can detect that a question is under debate and just not try and answer it then? That means that we very much have this aggressive suppression effect on things. And it means that people who oppose a particular viewpoint, which tends to be consensus reality, actually have a way of actually suppressing that by creating the illusion of debate. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't cases where there are minority opinions that shouldn't be highlighted in these kinds of things, but this is the kind of challenge we face. And is the earth flat? Is another canonical example of this. As far as I can tell, it is some amount of sincere, earnest people who believe the earth is flat, and a lot of trolls who think it's funny to act like they earnestly believe the earth is flat. But it ends up having a suppressive effect if you're not careful about it. So actually, one of the questions that naturally comes up here is, why bother trying? Why not just say, just fall back on 10 blue links? Like, come on, do we really need to put this in a box at the top of the page? And the answer is, of course, in some very literal sense, sure, we don't have to try. But I think one of the key bits here is there's an inevitability of rich experience in search. There's an inevitability that we are not going to have 10 blue links on a huge fraction of these kinds of queries. And actively knocking us back to 1998 doesn't solve the problem. We're going to have a rich experience. We need to think about this. But I think there's also the problem of we actually have a lot of really good things here that actually going immediately to the CDC, going immediately to popular mechanics and explaining the actual, both the direct intent of this user's question and the implicit context behind it, and important facts and natures about the world that people might idly look at and want to understand the nature of the threats of hate in this world, things where people ask sincere questions about race and things like this that we actually can give scientifically compelling and interesting answers to, are important as for things for us to do as Google. We're and that's sort of my product, rah pitch of this is, I think this is important. Now, that said, we are as of course we're under a code yellow after the recent explosions, and we're trying to be more conservative. And in fact, unfortunately, this is one of the bits of collateral damage that we no longer supply this answer out of a little bit of a surplus of caution at this moment. And that makes me sad. We'll get it back. We'll figure it out. But it's the kind of thing that these are the things that I get to when we say why try. So, did you have a question?
Yeah. So when you said code yellow, is that just a knob of like recall versus, or is that like specific?
No. It's very specific. So in fact, approximately, if we just tune our knob, if we say tune coverage back 10%, we tune coverage on awful queries back 10%, which that's not good enough. We need to tune coverage on awful things. We need to tune awful answers back 98%, not back 10%, not back 20%. If I really wish it was a matter of we could just tune like all of them are right near the threshold, no, then that'd be great, but it's not the case. The good news is, compared to 2 weeks ago, we're in shockingly good shape. We're not yet at 98%, but we're a large fraction of the way from where we were to now, at some collateral cost. So I spent most of the time highlighting a lot of the kinds of challenges and problems that we face. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the solutions. So first of all, I wanted to talk about the high-level way that we think about all of these kinds of problems, and that is eval. We spend a lot of time looking at individual queries, and by looking at individual queries, it helps us see things. If we notice conspicuously the casserole soup problem or the men-women problem, well, we're going to see that in our general eval, and we're going to see that once we create sort of these antagonistic sets, these sets that are sort of to measure these specific things. This is the main way we do it. Because one of the problems we have is search, for those who are not sort of familiar with the inner workings of it, tends to be these days this interesting mix of what I tend to call artisanal models and machine learned models. That is, we have a lot of things, a lot of little hand coded things. WebAnswers is an artisanal ensemble of machine learned models, is I guess probably the best way to put it. But fundamentally, even though I understand the kinds of errors a launch could introduce, and someone says, oh, I'm introducing a launch that does this with people names, well, I know what kinds of things to look for in that, and I look for those in the eval. So eval is the absolute first and foremost, but I think this notion of focused eval and identifying these things like these adversarial sets is going to be a large part of the solution. Second is actually debugging, and by debugging here, I mean something a little specific. So actually, Avinash, who works on my team, leads the team building deep neural models of for question answering. One of the challenges we have there is I understand what this type match-based system that figures out that Abraham Lincoln is a president, I understand intimately, because it's essentially a system that does some awesome counting, what kinds of errors it can make. I understand the patterns well. A deep neural model, it might learn crazy things. So we launched this deep neural model, but before we launched this deep neural model, we spent a lot of time building customized debugging tools that allow us to say, let's look inside the neural model. I jokingly call it, let's psychoanalyze the neural model. Let's say, what if we drop this word from the question? What if we drop this word from the answer? How does that change our scoring? That's the thing outside the box. Inside the box, we say, oh, what does this neuron seem to capture? We can do this sort of, what is the maximal neuron activation? We go, oh, this one counts punctuation. Oh, that's really useful for list-seeking queries. Oh, but this one is an anti-stuffing neuron, so that an answer composed exclusively of commas isn't counted as good. And like we actually discovered this about something else. Some of the neurons like, oh, what the hell is this? It's a thing. It seems to do all sorts of crazy stuff, and partially techniques like dropout actually sort of are antagonistic to this kind of thing. But at the same time, we can definitely do this. But these debugging tools that allow us to understand and learn earn a mental model. So as an example, one of the big things in the first versions of this deep neural model we learned is, oh, what is it really good at? It is really good at recognizing things that look like horrible answers. And it's really good at suppressing those. And that allows us to drag up all sorts of other good stuff that was just below our threshold. And then it continues to sort of go, oh, but that one's awful. My favorite example here, and I don't want to overcredit the neural model for completely solving this, but it largely was hit the query, how did Scalia die? And the answer, we actually have a pretty strong answer from the knowledge graph that it's natural causes. So we actually highly bias ourselves towards answers that contain the phrase natural causes. So we picked some guy's blog that said, Scalia died of natural causes, my ass. And that's what we showed. It turns out that our neural model is very good at knowing my ass is a horrible phrase to have in the context of this query, while ass is a perfectly good word in queries about donkeys. And that's great. We don't answer Scalia died of natural causes, my ass anymore. So next, I said I would talk about user feedback. So this is one of these big things that we imagine is going to work, and it sort of does. So the interesting problem is we allow users to give feedback. We have this little link here. We're working on making it somewhat more prominent, but the problem is when we make it more prominent, it gets noisier. Users who give us feedback mostly give us crap feedback. And by that, I specifically mean there are two big categories of crap feedback. One is people who don't like reality. Every day, we get a ton of reports for queries related to Gamergate with angry comments about how it's about ethics in journalism. Every day, queries about Gamergate do bad things in this regard. People don't like the perspective that is consensus on a lot of these things. We get angry queries about things that I have no idea why they're angry. The comment is just, this is not like, it looks like a flawless answer. It looks like one of those Scooby-Doo answers. And the checkbox is, this is wrong. And the comment is, fuck you. It's like, okay, that's a lot of our feedback. The other big category of our feedback is, my website should be higher ranked than it is. You shouldn't be getting this from my competitor. You shouldn't be getting this, you should be getting it from mine. All right, so we've got a lot of junk user feedback, but we actually do get a lot of real user feedback. So one of the things we do, and this is part of the process of allowing these things to get internally escalated, is subject to various thresholds, and then we send some of these things off to human raters. We say, do we think these kinds of things are the kinds of things that need to be escalated? And then we escalate them internally in the exact same way that a go bad report from a fellow Googler would be. And that means that if you know, we're trying to correct for some of our biases, the fact that, and then actually let me highlight one particular bias that I worry about a lot here, which is we spend a lot of time on queries in English. We spend way less time looking at queries in other languages. We have a team in Japan. We have a bunch of folks who speak and are fluent in languages other than English. We spend some time, we spend way more total time looking in English. So this user feedback chain is important. We've done some experiments on ways to increase the quality of the user feedback, and it's hard to do it without actually degrading the user experience around search in various ways, but we are likely to continue down the path on some of these kinds of things in the not too distant future. But user feedback is hard. One of the things sorry, you have a question? No. One of the things that I think is we're hoping to experiment with here is this notion of when users give us feedback, we give them a bunch of choices. We're going to change some of these choices. Because what if the answer is, I don't like this answer, or this answer offends me? That is different than saying it is wrong or missing. And if you only give them the choices of these things, they're going to say something is wrong or something is missing. And that, you know, in some cases, the line between wrong and I don't like it is borderline. But we're hoping by expanding some of these options, we can capture both users' sort of general dissatisfaction with it, some more of the nuance. I'm not actually super optimistic about that working, but we have to try it. All right, so algorithmically, our single biggest strategy is this general notion of what we call flight to authority. So if I search for what kind of dog is Scooby-Doo, or if I search for you know, how long is a particular board game or whatever it is, if I get it from some random guy's blog, that's sort of okay. If I search for, is it safe to give ibuprofen to a toddler? I don't want to have that from some random guy's blog. I want to have it from an authoritative source. I want to have it from WebMD or the CDC or things like that. Heck, do vaccines cause autism? I want that from the CDC, not from even just some individual person. I want to get to that sort of authoritative source. And I think it's actually important that we recognize that this is not a totally universal thing, in the sense that these more frivolous things, actually, there's a lot of value in these kinds of answers. And there's a lot of value to the ecosystem of us not requiring everyone to be highly authoritative. But there's enough user value to override that sort of ecosystem wish of, oh, how does that new medical site get its authority? It's going to take them a little while, and that's a sort of negative side effect. But I think it's the root of what we need to do. And this is the kind of thing that both Ranking and WebAnswers are focusing on as the root of it. If we can classify that our vaccines, or do vaccines cause autism, is a query that we need to get to authority. But it's not a query that we don't need to answer. It's a query that we need to go to authoritative sources on. So finally, this is a project that has been underway for several months, and I wish we had gotten here sooner, which is we're calling complex answers. So we talk about the product goal of WebAnswers being to answer the way a expert librarian or expert assistant would answer. There are a lot of questions, and never mind these controversial questions. There are a lot of questions like, what are the benefits of biking to work? Is it worth it to replace my foundation? What is the culture of Japan like? Where if I go to an expert librarian, or they're not going to say, oh, it's like this, goodbye. They're going to say, oh, it's complicated. Let me tell you about multiple aspects of these things. By benefits of biking to work, I can tell you about the health benefits. I can tell you about the environmental benefits. I can tell you about the economic benefits. If you're talking about, is it worth to replace your foundation? Okay, well, let's talk about the different kinds of foundation. The answer is it's complicated. It's not that we can't actually figure this out. It's a harder problem for Google. It's the next step. It's the sort of evolution of WebAnswers. But we actually think we have a pretty good set of signals that tells, oh, what's the culture of Japan like? Well, you mean religion and food and art. These are the things that compose the culture of Japan, and we can give you information about those. And in fact, today, we have the beginnings of this with a project called Related Questions. So this is actually a individually bad answer that narrowly talks about clothes. It's not horrible, but it talks about individually another. But then we say, oh, what sports are they good at? What is the belief of sort of bad English here, but and these kinds of things of can we do more structured versions of these is very appealing for how we can actually expose some of the richness of these kinds of things. And we have a bunch of other UIs for exposing the richness of multiple answers. You say, is Obamacare good? We shouldn't just say yes or no. We should say, hey, look, there's multiple facets to what does it even mean for it to be good, and there's multiple actually distinct perspectives, and that is complex answers. The last bit I wanted to mention is this idea of inoculation. And the idea here is that for certain categories of queries, the query is so leading and so charged that it's hard for the results, it's hard for anything to be about anything other than the awfulness. And so to give a not entirely awful example, but is a sort of simple example, is the Earth flat? Actually, if we show people information about what shape is the Earth, that actually satisfies their true actual intent, but at the same time doesn't have the bias of all these things that saying by saying flat in your query, you're going to get results that say flat in them. And yeah, there might be a debunking page out there, but this notion of inoculation. Now, the problem with going too far in inoculation is you're stopping and failing to serve the actual user need. The user is actually asking, does jet fuel melt steel beams? And we just said buildings can collapse even if the steel beams don't melt. That's a little bit antagonistic to the user's intent. And instead what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're getting these things where it actually serves the, someone's not unmuted on the phone. So these things where
Hello, hi guys, I think you went on mute.
Oh, there we go.
All right, there we go. All right, so this idea of basically can we figure out how to do this and then communicate clearly to the user when we think we're doing something different. So as an example here, web search does this. This result is not actually a good result for how to commit suicide. We have, in this case, also a one box, but in a lot of cases, you actually want the organic results. People are going to organic results and having this kind of injection where we can understand that there's a way to move this in the direction that we want. That's the end of my slides. I would love to hear questions or thoughts, and certainly we'd welcome any collaboration on folks who have sort of ideas, particularly for how to measure some of these things, because I think measuring is going to be the first step to actually making a lot of these things better. No questions? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about, so there's the actual problem, there's also the perception problem. So to the outside world, Google is kind of a black box, and how do we...
Yeah, so on Monday, so we, this is old. So we released updated rating guidelines on Monday, and wow, horrible search results for this. All right, here we go. So this is one of the ways that we do it. Is we basically, we have our, wow, nice that. We have our rating guidelines, which is what you use in eval. And this is actually the foundation of how we do most of this stuff. And one of the things we do externally is we talk about, we released those rating guidelines for the first time a year or two or three, somewhere, not ages ago, but not super recently. And then this week we released an update basically saying, look, we recognize that in many ways the world has changed around some of these hate speech things, some of these fake news kinds of things, and we're now very expressly measuring that. And I think that is a key way that we search. Now, the other aspect of it is comes back to the user harm and trust thing of, there are some firestorms here, and I think we do right by the user to be a little bit patient in making sure that we're attending them and recognize that some of these things are people going to make noise about them sort of no matter what we do. But at the same time, we have to look at what the real underlying problems are. And we found that after this most recent one, there are a bunch. The great news is it's really teeny. There's just a spotlight on them, and therefore we need to do something about it. Ross, questions on VC?
Yeah, I've got one. What do you do about the problem that the notion of what is an authoritative source intrinsically has some bias? I mean, certainly there's examples now where something like the Washington Post, which canonically or historically might have been accepted as a good and trustworthy source of news information, has parties that are saying that it's fake news. And so how do we decide what counts as authoritative?
I think this is one of the big open questions in both policy and just sort of how we think about this from a product perspective. I think, for example, one of the questions that has also been asked along the same vein is, what happens if existing authorities are subverted in some way? What if suddenly the NASA webpage on climate change tomorrow changed radically? How would we think about that? So the good news is that we have really smart policy folks thinking about how we can structure language and guidelines, because fundamentally this comes down to our eval. If our eval and our external state guidelines around these things say, this is how we define authority, and the authority gets subverted in some way and it meets that definition, that's sort of the problem. So how do we define authority? How do we define trustworthiness? And there's a bunch of language in the Radar guidelines that basically talks about expert consensus. It talks about things like, well, there's a really nice phrase in there, something to the effect of, of sorry, I don't remember, but it's a phrase that basically conveys is a nicely compact definition of fake news, of basically, undisputed facts or not. And then we don't call them facts, it's some other phrasing. So this is a really, really hard problem. And I think this is the step towards it. And to be honest, I think there's a lot of sort of stress around how do we do it if suddenly, reality denial, or well, wait, maybe we're the ones in reality denial. How do we resolve that? And I think there's a bunch of folks who have thought about various techniques here, but I think it really comes down to eval. Now, the good news is our raters are amazing at following instructions. Like our rating guidelines are like 100 and something pages, 160 pages. You have to take multiple exams to get qualified as a rater, et cetera, and they are amazingly good. And I think I would welcome other thoughts on how we can mitigate this, but I think there's a danger in Google trying to become the arbiter of truth. I think it is, that is the notion of us being the arbiter of authority is hard, but I think it's more tractable than us being the arbiter of truth. But if we have a way of becoming the arbiter of truth that we think is robust, then maybe we should think about that.
I wonder if you could sort of throw that open to the community. You have, I saw a graph in some article the other week that sort of characterized all the well-known news outlets from left end to right end, the way you would think about them on a political spectrum. And I kind of glanced at it and I said, well, yeah, that's kind of consistent with my notion of those things. But right now, that notion of baseline truth is very much under fire. But and you have to be very careful about not making Google become the arbiter of truth there, because then we become inclined to attacks about our own objectivity. But maybe you could do something like take a big survey among that group to say, hey, everybody, rate everyone else on this list from left to right. And then you, of course, would get the outliers voting crazy things about all the others on this list. But, law of large numbers says that would tend to even out.
Yeah, maybe. I'll admit my experience with express user feedback leads me to some skepticism there, but I think, I think there might be something there. Yeah. I think a lot of cases we can actually use things like implicit user feedback signals. One of the ways that we can detect certain categories of hate is by understanding that it's not they necessarily share content similarity, it's they share who goes to them, and we say, oh, this is fringe in that particular way, and that's a useful understanding. And it turns out, like, you learn interesting things about the hate community. Like when we did a wave of hate suppression a year and a half ago, we found we lost a lot of really good answers about carpentry, because it turns out white supremacists like to ask for carpentry tips from other white supremacists, and they actually are perfectly good carpenters. And it's like, well, okay, wait, what? Okay, at some level, this notion of, an affinity group around something like hate. It's like, oh, right, these are hateful people, but they're hateful people who also do carpentry and cook and do other things. And it makes, and on one hand, I really did not enjoy my time looking at other people's hate sites, but it did sort of open my eyes about the nature of the hate community. And I guess in particular, the scary thing here, and this is why I sort of go hesitant on user feedback, is some of them are just vitriolic, awful human beings. But some of them, it's just their worldview that their race, where it's almost always white people, is better than the other ones. And like, they're not like mean about it. They're just like, well, it's just an objective fact. It's like them saying that I'm taller than you. It's like, they don't think it's mean. They think, well, this is just the way the world is. And that notion that this is earnest, they will answer a survey honestly, something that they believe this is simply true is an important part of recognizing the spectrum of hate and worldview. It's not angry people who have hormone disorders.
I'm really scared by what you just said, because I do a lot of carpentry.
Well,
for the record, I'm not a white supremacist.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
13.